Some places live in your bones. Lake Haven wasn't just a house, it was the part of me my family never bothered to understand. I was standing at my kitchen window in Boston mug of chamomile tea cooling in my hand when I felt that familiar ache. The kind that didn't come from stress or lack of sleep, it came from absence. From a place so rooted in who I was that not being there felt like missing a piece of myself. Lake Haven. The rustic lodge Grandpa Arthur built with his own two hands perched by a quiet lake in Vermont surrounded by pine trees that held every one of my childhood secrets. A place where my thoughts felt less like noise and more like clarity. I hadn't been up there in over a month. Work deadlines, meetings, late-night design revisions, they had kept me tethered to the city. But this morning was different. The project I'd been leading for the last 6 months had finally been approved. My inbox was blessedly empty. My body was exhausted, but my spirit was tugging northward. I opened my notebook, flipping to the dog-eared letter I always kept tucked inside the front cover. Grandpa had written it 3 months before he passed in that steady handwriting that looked like it came straight from an architect's drafting table. Claire. This house isn't just wood and stone. It's the shape of solitude, the kind that heals rather than isolates. You've always understood that. That's why I'm leaving it to you, not out of favoritism, but because I know you'll protect it. One day, this place will be the only thing that feels real when everything else feels fake. Love, Grandpa A. I traced the edge of the paper, reading the words I'd memorized 100 times. They still made my chest tighten in that bittersweet way grief often does. He saw me when no one else in the family really did. Not my mother with her flawless smile and avoidance of uncomfortable truths. Not my father with his silent judgments and subtle preference for ease over conflict. And certainly not Madison, my younger sister, who never had to ask twice for anything. I shut the notebook and grabbed my phone. A quiet weekend at Lake Haven sounded perfect. Some painting, minor repairs, and silence. The kind only pine trees and loons could provide. I was just opening the weather app when a text popped up from Mom. No need to drive up this weekend. Your dad already hired someone to check on the house. I blinked. Hired someone. Since when I typed back, "Who did he hire?" I always go through Ben from the local service. No response. I stared at the screen. My thumb hovered over the call button, but I hesitated. This wasn't the first time they'd done this. Made decisions about things that weren't theirs. Acted like it was easier to just handle it than involve me. But this felt different. Lake Haven was mine. Legally, emotionally, spiritually. A flicker of unease curled in my stomach. Still, I shoved the feeling down. Maybe Dad just wanted to be helpful. Maybe they were finally learning to show care in their own strange way. I decided to distract myself. Just a quick scroll through Instagram, I told myself. Something light. I opened the app and immediately saw Madison's post from last night. A glossy photo of her standing in a bridal boutique holding a flute of champagne, her smile blinding. Massive wedding vibes coming. Thank you, family, for making my dream possible. My heart thudded once. I scrolled to the comments. Most were what you'd expect. Yes, Queen, you're gonna be such a stunning bride. Family goals. But one comment nestled halfway down caught me off guard. Heard the lake house sale went through, wedding of the year incoming. I stared at it. Reread it. Felt the breath leave my body. Lake house sale. I hadn't agreed to sell anything. No one had even asked. My tea had gone cold in my hand. I placed it on the counter, trying to steady myself. No. There had to be a mistake. Maybe the commenter was confused. Maybe they meant something else. Maybe this was just another misunderstanding in a family full of crossed wires and assumed consent. But deep down, I knew better. The tension in Mom's text. The silence when I asked follow-up questions. Madison's sudden access to more extravagance. I dropped into the nearest chair, gripping the edges like the floor might fall out beneath me. My eyes flicked back to the screen. The comment was still there, bright and casual, like it hadn't just detonated something inside me. Claire freezes. Lake house sale. She never agreed to sell anything. In my family, silence was the preferred currency. If you didn't question, you were easier to love. The Whitmore home in Boston was immaculate as always. Not a single cushion out of place, not a speck on the marble countertops, not a moment unaccounted for. Dinner was roasted sea bass with citrus-glazed truffle risotto and a salad no one touched. Conversation like the meal was curated light, pleasant, and designed to look impressive from the outside. Madison, you have to show Claire the invitation samples, my mother said as she dabbed the corner of her lip with a linen napkin. Oh, they're embossed, hand-pressed in Italy, Madison said, eyes gleaming. Each one is wrapped in silk ribbon and sealed with real wax. Not just any wax. Gold-infused. I blinked. Isn't that a little over the top? Madison grinned like she'd won a prize. It's my only wedding, Claire. I bit back the obvious retort. Ethan, her fiancé, chuckled politely and reached for more wine. My father swirled his glass in slow circles and nodded with a smug kind of satisfaction. I saw your last update, I said, trying to sound casual. The gown from Paris. Photographer from LA. Destination honeymoon in Bali. Sounds like quite the event. Madison twirled a strand of hair between her fingers, pleased with herself. 15,000 for the photographer. But he's a genius. And the gown worth every euro. And Bali. God, Claire, you should see the villa. You know Lake Haven could be a perfect pre-wedding shoot location, I offered. The light near the dock at sunset is. No, my mother said too fast. I blinked. Why not? She set her fork down gently. It's just complicated now. I waited for more. There was none. Complicated how my father cleared his throat and smiled tightly. Let's not ruin dinner with logistics. You know weddings, so many moving pieces. Ethan raised his eyebrows but didn't speak. Madison reached for her phone and started scrolling. I could feel the familiar current beneath the table, the one that had hummed my entire life. The rule that wasn't spoken but always enforced. Do not challenge the narrative. Don't ask questions. Questions were ungrateful. Questions were divisive. I looked at them. The family who could fill a room with noise but never say a real thing. A flash from childhood flickered to the front of my mind. Madison at age 6 throwing a tantrum over ballet shoes that weren't the right shade of pink. My mother had rushed to calm her, calling every store in the state until she found the perfect pair. I had watched from the staircase, clutching a spelling bee ribbon I'd just won, hoping someone would notice. No one had. Later, I'd set the ribbon on the kitchen counter where my father would see it. He picked it up briefly, muttered nice, then set it beneath the grocery list. I learned early silence got you overlooked, but questioning got you iced out entirely. Still, I pushed. I just don't understand, I said now. Why not take a few photos there? It's meaningful to the family. Grandpa built it, Claire. My mother interrupted with a brittle smile. Let's just say we had to make some decisions quickly. My father nodded, placing his napkin on his plate with finality. We had to let it go at the right time. I stared at him. What does that mean? It means, he said carefully, sometimes we need to move forward. Not everything from the past fits into the future. Madison still hadn't looked up from her phone. My heart began to pound, not the sharp panic of alarm, but the slow, sinking kind. The kind you get when you're watching the edge of something crumble. You let it go, I repeated, voice low. As in, sold it. No one answered. The table grew unbearably still. Ethan took a sip of wine. Madison laughed at something on her screen. My mother's eyes flicked to my father, then to her glass. My father gave me that smile he used when he thought he could soften something just by pretending it was already fine. But it wasn't fine, and something inside me knew I was the only one at that table who hadn't known for a while. I left shortly after dessert. No one stopped me. My mother air-kissed my cheek and said something about a fitting next week. My father told me to drive safe. Madison waved with her phone still in her hand. In the car, I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't call anyone. I drove in silence, the city lights bleeding into each other through the windshield. Back at my apartment, I poured a glass of water, ignored it, and opened my laptop. My fingers moved almost on their own typing in the Vermont State Property Database. It took a few clicks, a few loading screens. I entered the parcel ID for Lake Haven Lodge. The page refreshed. Under current deed holder, it no longer said Claire Whitmore. Claire froze. Later that night, Claire looks up the Vermont Property Database. Her name is no longer on the deed. I drove 3 hours to Vermont hoping it was a clerical error. The gravel crunch beneath my tires said otherwise. The road to Lake Haven was just as I remembered, winding, quiet, shadowed by trees that had watched me grow up. I gripped the steering wheel tighter with each turn, trying to drown the dread rising in my throat. Maybe it was a glitch in the state database. Maybe I'd read the wrong entry. But the sinking feeling that had haunted me since that dinner clung to my skin like humidity. As I turned onto the long gravel drive, the first thing I noticed was the missing sign. Grandpa Arthur had carved it by hand, Lake Haven Lodge, Est 1978. It had always hung proudly between 2 white posts at the entrance. Now nothing. Just empty space and fresh screw holes. Then I saw the truck. A massive white moving van sat parked in the circular drive like it belonged there. The lodge's front door stood wide open. Men in uniforms were hauling my boxes into the back of the truck. The deck chairs I had painted last summer. The fishing rod Grandpa gave me at age 10. The old quilt from the guest room with the stitched blue pine trees. All of it. My foot slammed the brake before I even reached the house. I jumped out of the car, barely remembering to throw it into park. "Excuse me," I shouted, striding toward the chaos. "What the hell is going on?" A middle-aged woman in cropped jeans and a crisp white blouse turned to face me, confusion written across her face. A man beside her held a clipboard. "Hi, can I help you?" the woman asked, cautiously friendly. "This is private property," I snapped. "Who gave you permission to be here?" The man extended a hand like this was a polite misunderstanding at a neighborhood bake sale. "I'm Robert Carson, and this is my wife, Linda. We bought this property 3 weeks ago." My stomach dropped. "That's not possible," I said. "You must have the wrong address." Linda pulled a folder from her purse. "This is 241 Lake Haven Road, correct?" I nodded slowly. "We closed on it last Friday," she said. "From a Thomas and Karen Whitmore." My breath caught. They're my parents, but they didn't have the right to sell this house. Robert's brow furrowed. "I'm sorry, but the deed is clear. Everything was processed legally. Do you want to see the documents?" I nodded stiffly. He handed me the folder and I flipped through the papers, already knowing what I would find. My name was on the title, at least it had been. The signatures were there, neat and precise, including mine. Except it wasn't mine. I stared at the loops and slants of the signature close, but not close enough. I knew every stroke of my name, every subtle curve. Whoever had forged it hadn't been sloppy, but they didn't know the way I curled the C or how I looped the tail of the E with a leftward lean. "This is a forgery," I whispered, holding the page between trembling fingers. The Carsons exchanged a glance. "We had no idea," Robert said, his voice quiet now. "The sale was through a licensed realtor. Everything looked legitimate." I nodded numbly. "You're not at fault. I just need a moment." I turned and stumbled back to my car, barely able to breathe. I dropped into the driver's seat and shut the door, the silence inside deafening. My hands gripped the steering wheel, then the folder, then my phone. My entire body shook. I tried calling Ted Johnson, our longtime caretaker, the man who had known Grandpa Arthur, who had helped with maintenance and watched over the property whenever I was away. The number went straight to voicemail. I tried again. Still nothing. Come on, Ted, I muttered. Where are you? I stared at the documents again. My parents' names, signature lines, sale dates, witness fields filled out with confidence. I didn't know what stunned me more, the fact that they had done this or that they thought I wouldn't notice. Or maybe they counted on me noticing too late. I felt a sob rise in my throat, unexpected and violent. I clamped a hand over my mouth, but it was no use. The tears came fast and merciless, spilling over onto the folder in my lap. My chest heaved. My body curled into itself. They'd taken it. They'd sold my sanctuary. The place Grandpa had entrusted to me. The place where I remembered how to breathe. They stole it, and they made it look clean. I sat in that car for who knows how long enough for my face to grow hot and blotchy, long enough for the movers to finish their work, and for the Carsons to politely retreat into the house that was no longer mine. I stared out at the lake through the windshield, the same view I had known since I was a child. But it looked different now, like it belonged to someone else. Like I was trespassing. I opened my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found Julia Sanders. We hadn't spoken much since law school. She'd gone into real estate law while I pursued architecture, but I remembered her sharp mind, her no bullshit attitude, and right now, I needed someone who could fight. My fingers hovered for only a second before typing, "Need a real estate attorney. Urgent. Family fraud. A forged signature is more than a lie. It's a knife dressed in ink." The papers lay spread across Julia's desk like the remnants of a dissected crime scene. Her office overlooked a quiet stretch of Commonwealth Avenue, but inside the energy was taut with restrained fury. She flipped the final page over her brow, knitting as she squinted at the notary's stamp. "Well," she said, finally looking up, "this isn't just shady. It's criminal." My throat tightened. "So you're sure?" Julia leaned back in her chair, her sleek bob shifting slightly. "Absolutely. First, your signature's forged. Sloppy but convincing enough to pass on a quick glance. Second, the notary listed here, Camille Watts. She moved to Arizona 2 years ago. She hasn't notarized anything in Vermont since. I just called her office." The blood drained from my face. "So this isn't just a betrayal, it's fraud. Forgery, falsifying legal documents, property theft. Your parents." Claire didn't just cross a line, they bulldozed through it. She slid a folder across to me, copies of the documents annotated. "We can file to contest the sale immediately. If we move quickly, we may even be able to halt any further changes to the property title." I reached for the folder, the edge scraping against my palm. Paper cut's the perfect metaphor for what my parents had done. Not an overt act of violence, but death by 1,000 slashes. Smooth, silent, final. "They really thought I wouldn't notice," I whispered. Or Julia said dryly, "They thought you'd notice too late." A part of me wanted to scream. Another part wanted to curl up and weep. But most of all, I wanted clarity. Answers. Justice. Julia's calm fire gave me something to hold on to. We left her office with a plan, timelines, and a long list of legal paperwork I barely absorbed. Outside, Boston pulsed with spring energies, sunlight on brick, the smell of budding trees, but inside me it still felt like winter. On the train home, I remembered something, just a flicker. A conversation from 2 months ago with Helen Collins, our neighbor at Lake Haven. She'd mentioned seeing my parents up at the house, something about rushing the sale. At the time, I'd brushed it off. Now it sounded like foreshadowing. I found her email in my inbox, one of those older threads I never deleted. "Hi, Helen, I need to ask something important. Do you remember anything specific about my parents being at Lake Haven in March or April? Any conversations? Anything that seemed off? Please be honest." Claire. I hit send and stared at the blinking cursor, feeling like the ground under me was slowly giving way. Seconds later, another message pinged in, but this one wasn't from Helen. It was from Aunt Ruth. I hadn't spoken to her in years. She'd drifted from the family, or maybe she'd been pushed. All I remembered was that she wore wide-brimmed hats, rarely attended holidays, and once told me at age 11, "Don't let their silence make you smaller." Her email was simple. Claire, I heard about the house. You're not the first girl in this family who got erased. If you're ready to talk, I'm in town. Ruth. I stared at the message, rereading the words like they were in another language. Got erased. I didn't know what stunned me more, her reaching out, or the implication that this wasn't new. We agreed to meet that afternoon at a quiet cafe tucked behind a florist near my parents' neighborhood. She was already seated when I arrived, a cup of black tea steaming in front of her. Her eyes, sharp and calm, met mine with no trace of hesitation. "Thank you for coming," I said. "I should have come years ago," she replied. We sat in silence for a moment, the din of espresso machines humming behind us. Then she spoke. "Your father rewrote our grandmother's will," she said flatly. "Not legally, not outright. But he manipulated her into thinking I didn't care about the property she left behind. Convinced her I wasn't responsible enough. When she passed, everything went to him. He claimed it was what she wanted." My mouth went dry. I'm saying your parents have done this before. Not this, blatantly, not with forged signatures, but the pattern is there. Favor the child who plays the role, silence the one who doesn't. I gripped my cup tightly, warmth burning through ceramic. "I left to survive," she said. "But I always regretted not warning you sooner. You were the quiet one, and in this family quiet means invisible." I wanted to cry, or scream, but all I managed was a nod. Helen's reply came that evening, short and to the point. "Claire, I absolutely remember overhearing your parents in early April at the general store. They were talking about wrapping the sale before Claire finds out. I'll write a formal statement if you need it." Helen. That was it. The crack had opened. By midnight, I was at my desk filling out the county's notice of intent to contest property sale based on fraudulent activity. My hands were steady, my jaw set. Every field I filled out felt like reclaiming something they tried to steal. When I hit submit, a strange calm washed over me. Not peace exactly, but power. Let's see how they enjoy surprises. They toasted to me with champagne I paid for in a ballroom funded by theft, and I smiled. The chandelier above the ballroom sparkled like it was trying to distract everyone from the rottenness below. At the Fairmont Copley, everything was gold-trim light, even the Prosecco foam on the signature cocktails being passed around on silver trays. The crowd was full of glittering dresses, tailored suits, and empty congratulations. I moved through it like a ghost with perfect posture. "Claire, you made it?" My mother beamed, brushing a stray hair behind my ear, as if the gesture still meant something. "That blue on you, it's so composed." Her smile faltered just slightly, the way it always did when I didn't return the warmth. "Thanks," I replied, eyes flicking toward the bar. Madison floated in 10 minutes later in what could only be described as a pre-wedding wedding dress, champagne-colored silk hand-beaded sleeves, a train longer than reason. She looked ethereal, manufactured, untouchable. People clapped when she entered. I sipped my drink and held my breath. This wasn't the place to cause a scene. That would come later. The engagement party was everything I had expected: expensive, performative, exhausting. Ethan shook hands with old college friends while my parents basked in the glow of parental achievement. I played my role: quiet but gracious sister, thoughtful, understated. The crowd buzzed with admiration. The same people who had ignored me at Christmas now pressed champagne flutes into my hand with thin smiles. "You're so generous, Claire. Not many would do what you did." "What a sacrifice. Madison's lucky to have you. I heard it was a private sale." That lake property was stunning. Real family treasure. Each word was another cut, slow and precise. I wanted to scream that it wasn't true, that I hadn't given anything. That they stole from me, lied about me, painted me into a narrative where I was the willing martyr. But I didn't. I nodded. I smiled. I said thank you as if I hadn't found out about the forged signature 2 weeks ago. I felt Ruth's presence beside me before I saw her. "They're all clapping for a story that doesn't belong to you," she murmured. "Let them clap. You'll speak later." I looked at her. Her eyes were calm but alert, like she'd seen every version of this party before. She squeezed my wrist, gently anchoring me to the moment. Dinner came. A string quartet played. Toasts were made. I barely touched my plate. And then Madison stood gently tapping a fork against her glass. The room fell quiet. "I just want to say," she began, her voice soft, tear-tipped, "that tonight feels like a dream. And it wouldn't be possible without my incredible family." Karen dabbed her eyes. Richard lifted his glass. And especially Claire Madison continued, turning toward me. "Who gave up something so special, so meaningful to make this wedding possible? I'll never forget what you did. Lake Haven was a part of our childhood and you let it go. For me." The room erupted into applause. Some people stood. Ethan looked at me, unsure whether to smile or look away. My mother beamed like she was presenting an award. My father raised his glass-high eyes, glinting, and I sat frozen in place, watching the story unfold like a bad play I'd never auditioned for. They'd turned my theft into a tribute, my silence into sainthood. My mouth went dry. Ruth leaned in again. "Smile," she said, "then burn the whole thing down." So I did. I stood and lifted my glass. To choices, I said evenly, "May we all face them someday." People clinked glasses, unsure whether to laugh or nod solemnly. I sat down. The show moved on. Later that night, I returned to my apartment and locked the door behind me. I kicked off my heels, poured a glass of wine, and opened my laptop. I stared at the blank document. Then I began to type. "To my parents, what you did was not just illegal. It was unforgivable. Forgery always leaves fingerprints. You just have to know where to look." Julia had always told me that revenge wasn't about rage, it was about architecture. "Don't hit back blindly," she said once over bourbon and burned ramen in law school. "Build your strike like a blueprint. Precise. Fatal." So that's what I did. Mid-June in Boston was humid, sticky with the scent of sidewalk heat and blossoming despair. Julia's office smelled like lemons and ink, and I found calm there, surrounded by manila folders and litigation-grade rage. Her heels clicked against the hardwood as she moved from the printer to her laptop like a surgeon between instruments. "Okay," she said, sliding me a stack of documents. "Let's talk digital paper trails." The first item was a set of access logs from my bank. 3 failed login attempts on May 3rd. All attempted with a near match to my password. All originating from an IP address linked to a residential network, my parents' house. I stared at the screen. That's the day the deed was signed. Julia nodded. And the same night the notarization timestamp was logged, around 3:08 a.m. "Because nothing says legitimate sale like committing cyber trespass in the middle of the night," I muttered. "We'll request metadata from the bank to match device ID next," she said. "And we're subpoenaing the notary records now. You'll love this part. The witness listed on your deed doesn't exist. Name's real, but the address leads to a parking lot in Springfield." I let out a low, humorless laugh. "So they forged the signature, faked the notary, and made up a witness." "Impressive." "Amateur hour," Julia replied. "You know who else called this morning?" I looked up. "Helen Collins. Said you emailed her." My pulse jumped. She remembered something. She remembered everything. Later that afternoon, I met Helen at a small coffee shop tucked between a florist and a real estate office. She looked older than I remembered, gray hair cropped close, cardigan sleeves rolled just so. But her eyes were sharp, watchful. The kind of woman who didn't forget things. "I don't like being involved in drama," she said as we settled at a corner table, "but what they did, That was rotten. I nodded. Just tell me what you heard. She sipped her tea slowly, then spoke. Early April. Your parents were in the general store. They didn't see me in the next aisle. Your dad said, "We need to finalize before Claire asks questions." Your mom replied, "Just get the papers signed. We'll deal with her later." The words hit harder than I expected, even knowing what I knew. "Would you be willing to put that in writing?" I asked. She reached into her purse and slid over a printed statement. "Already done. Dated and signed." I blinked. "You're scary organized." "Decades in library science," she said. "Lies don't like records." Back in Julia's office that evening, we added Helen's testimony to the growing stack of files. Julia called in an IT consultant, quiet, bespectacled, and far too young to run IP verifications and confirm geolocation matches. When he left, Julia locked eyes with me over her glasses. "Do you realize how rare this is?" she asked. To get this clean a trail on a family fraud case, I didn't answer right away. My mind kept circling back to those login attempts. 3 tries. At 3 in the morning. I imagined my father hunched over a laptop, swearing under his breath, while my mother hovered nearby with a glass of wine, offering suggestions. They didn't just steal from me, they did it methodically. Together. I stared at the digital printout, each entry a timestamp, a digital heartbeat of betrayal. Julia slid one last sheet in front of me, the official IP trace result. Logged May 3rd, 3:08 a.m., origin 27 Wexford Lane, my childhood home. She sat back, folding her arms. "You have enough now to not only sue," she said, voice low and deliberate, "but destroy them. My grandfather always hid the most important things in plain sight, like his trust in me." The brass key had been sitting on my bookshelf for years, wedged between 2 cracked paperbacks and a ceramic turtle I made in 7th grade. I used to toy with it while on the phone, spinning it between my fingers without thinking. Grandpa Arthur gave it to me the summer I turned 17, after a long afternoon staining the porch at Lake Haven. "You'll know when you need it," he said. He didn't elaborate. He never did. It was late on a Sunday when the memory came back, sudden, sharp, and unshakable. I sat bolt upright on my couch, heart pounding with clarity. I remembered the box, the one he'd handed me the week before he died. We were standing in his Cambridge apartment, and he placed it in my arms like it weighed more than it should have. "Don't open it unless the house is in danger," he said. At the time, I thought he meant weather. Flooding. Maybe a tax issue. I never imagined this. The next morning, I drove to the storage facility in silence, the brass key heavy in my palm, the entire ride. The attendant barely looked up as he buzzed me into the elevator. Unit 414. I hadn't visited in almost 2 years. The locker smelled like dust and old wood. I found the box immediately, top shelf under a tarp, labeled in his blocky handwriting, "Claire. Only if needed." My fingers trembled as I unlocked the brass latch and lifted the lid. Inside was a sealed envelope, thick with folded papers. No dust on it. Like it had been waiting. The writing across the front was unmistakable. "For Claire. If they ever try to take what's yours, show them who they underestimated. Grandpa A." I sat on the cold floor and opened it with reverence. The first page was a letter. Long handwritten, in his slow, deliberate cursive. "Claire, I'm not paranoid, but I am a Whitmore, and I've seen what this family does when something has value. They take. They spin truth into suggestion. Lake Haven is not a thing. It is a truth. A place where honesty breathes and peace waits. You loved it for what it was, not what it could be sold for. That's why I chose you. If they try to erase that, erase, you use this." The second page was a codicil, an unfiled amendment to his original will, dated 1 year after the first. Handwritten, witnessed, notarized. Addendum to last will and testament. Under no circumstances shall Lake Haven Lodge be sold, transferred, or encumbered without the express written consent of Claire Whitmore. I leave full moral and emotional stewardship to her. I trust her to love it the way I did. My vision blurred. I read it 3 more times as if the ink might vanish if I blinked too hard. Then the final line of the letter, "You are the only one I trust to love it the way I did." That broke me. I leaned against the metal wall and cried the ugly body-shaking kind. Not just for the betrayal, but for the quiet, solid love that had somehow endured through paper and time. He knew. He'd always known. And he'd given me the one thing the rest of my family never had: belief. By the time I drove home, the sky had turned the color of pewter. The codicil sat on my passenger seat like a co-pilot in war. I placed the pages on my desk, smoothed them out, and took a photo with perfect lighting, clear, legible, impossible to ignore. Then I opened my phone and texted Julia. Ready to escalate. Let's go public. If this was a fairy tale wedding, I was the cursed mirror they forgot to shatter. The Ivybrook estate glistened like a fantasy drawn in watercolor. Rolling green hills, white blossoms suspended like snowflakes in the July breeze, and staff members in crisp black vests moving like clockwork. Everywhere I turned, guests buzzed about Madison's perfect day, sipping lavender cocktails and admiring the floating swan centerpieces. I stood at the periphery, swathed in a blush bridesmaid dress that I hadn't chosen makeup applied by a professional whose name I never learned. My smile was as polished as the silverware, hollow, controlled, unreadable. The morning had been a blur of floral arrangements and breathless squeals. Madison pranced around the bridal suite like royalty on parade. Her dress was a glittering force of nature. French lace cathedral train, imported crystal embroidery. All of it paid for by theft. I adjusted her veil without flinching. "You always had a steady hand," she said, her voice light, oblivious. I offered a smile. Some things require it. In the hallway, the wedding planner was coordinating with a florist who had forgotten half the orchids. Nightmare. She sighed to no one in particular. Then she turned to me, clipboard in hand. "Honestly, though, this family amazing. The way they pulled off the funding, that lake house thing. Not every bride gets that level of commitment." I blinked. "No, not every bride." She bustled off before I could ask more. But I didn't need clarification. The story had become their currency. It had passed from lips to ears and grown roots. Claire gave it up for love. Claire made it possible. I felt myself drifting through the afternoon like a specter, adjusting floral hoops, fetching water bottles, holding Madison's train while she posed like a porcelain doll. Ethan, on the other hand, was a study in disquiet. I caught him more than once checking his phone behind the hedges screen, brightness turned low, his jaw clenched, eyes darting. At one point, I saw him staring at the wedding invoice binder the planner had left on a table, his fingers tightening around the corner of the page. Money trouble, I thought. He knew. In the corner of the reception tent, Ruth stood beside a stone column sipping lemonade like it was laced with arsenic. Her hat was comically wide, shielding her from the sun and from stares. "They're clapping now," she murmured when I passed by. "Wait till they scream." I said nothing. I was the silent thread woven into the satin. Dinner was served under twinkle lights. The band played soft jazz while servers passed dishes of truffle risotto and champagne-glazed sea bass. Every detail was exquisite, every centerpiece manicured. I watched it all from my designated seat center table, of course, beside the proud parents and the golden couple. Then came the toasts. Richard stood first, beaming, his voice warm and syrupy. Karen dabbed at her eyes theatrically. Madison's best friend gave a rambling speech about destiny and designer heels. Ethan said something about love being an investment. He was only half listening to his own words. And then Madison rose. "I've waited my whole life for this," she said, placing a hand delicately over her heart. "Not just for Ethan, but for a day like today." A day where I feel fully seen, supported, celebrated. Polite applause. She turned toward me. The room followed her gaze, and none of this would have been possible without my sister. I froze my champagne flute halfway to my lips. Claire, she said, smiling sweetly, you gave up something precious so that we could have this. A house, a legacy, a dream. You made the ultimate sacrifice, and we will never forget it. The room erupted into applause. Some people stood. Karen looked misty-eyed. Richard beamed like a godfather sealing a blood pact. I nodded robotic, raising my glass just enough. The night blurred after that cake-cutting first dance, the father-daughter waltz choreographed to a string quartet cover of Perfect. I drifted through it all, invisible, untouchable, watching as they built their altar atop stolen wood. Near midnight, I wandered out onto the terrace, needing space. The stars above the Vermont hills glimmered, ancient and impassive. I stared into my champagne glass, the bubbles gone flat. And tomorrow, I whispered to myself, you'll learn the cost of everything you thought was free. They thought the wedding was the ending. It was the opening act. At exactly 9:00 a.m., the courier confirmed delivery. The legal packet, thick, damning, and entirely devoid of sentiment, had been handed to my parents' brownstone door. Julia called me 2 minutes later, her voice steady with satisfaction. They signed for it. You're officially in play. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. Time to change the locks on the narrative. An hour later, I sent the letter. The one I'd rewritten 7 times, each version more restrained than the last. It wasn't about rage anymore. It was about precision. The letter was attached to a simple email. No subject line, no emojis, no distractions. Mom, Dad, what you did was not only illegal, it was a betrayal that redefined everything I thought we were. You didn't just sell a house. You stole a part of me, Claire. And then I waited. The first few hours were blessedly quiet. Then the text started. From Dad, please call us. From Mom, there's been a huge misunderstanding. From Dad again, we need to fix this as a family. And then, you can't do this to your sister. I didn't reply. Around noon, the vibration of my phone rattled the ceramic tray on my desk. FaceTime. Madison. I let it ring until the call ended. A minute later, it came again. This time, I answered. Her face filled the screen, glowing in the tropical sun. Behind her, palm trees swayed and the faint sound of a waterfall trickled through the speakers. Her hair was up, sunglasses perched on her head, drink in hand. Claire. She began, already trembling. What the hell is happening? Good morning, I said. Or, good evening, in Bali. She ignored that. My phone's exploding. Mom is hysterical. Ethan's getting calls from his firm. The Petersons want to cancel escrow. What did you do? I took a breath, choosing calm over cruelty. I filed a lawsuit. Forgery, fraudulent transfer, civil theft. Her jaw dropped. You're suing our parents. I'm suing the people who stole my property and forged my name to do it. If that includes our parents, that's on them. She stared at me in disbelief. Why now? Why wait until after the wedding? Because I knew none of you would listen, before I said. And I wasn't going to be the villain in your fairy tale. But now that the show's over, let's talk reality. From behind her, Ethan appeared, half-dressed, holding his phone and visibly tense. Tell her to stop, he muttered off camera. It's a PR nightmare. Madison turned away and barked something I couldn't hear. Then back to me, eyes glassy. You couldn't have just talked to us, I did? I said, voice sharpening. I asked about the house. You lied. I suggested using it for your photos, and Mom said it was complicated. Dad said, we had to let it go at the right time. You all knew. You just hoped I'd stay quiet. Her composure cracked. Did you ever love me at all? The question knocked the air from my lungs. Not because it wasn't fair, but because it was too fair. I swallowed. Yes, But love without respect is just manipulation. She said nothing. Her lips parted, then closed again. The reflection of herself flickered on her oversized sunglasses, and for once she looked small. Not beautiful, not center stage, just confused. I ended the call without another word. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was surgical. It was the sound of something finally being severed. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I didn't feel like the girl watching her family rewrite her life. I felt like the author. The law doesn't care about family dinners. It cares about signatures and silence broken at the right time. Monday arrived like a gavel. Julia met me at her office with a stack of documents and the kind of calm urgency that meant the real war had begun. "We're filing the injunction today," she said, sliding a folder across the table. "It'll freeze any proceeds tied to the house sale. That means your parents can't move the money. No new accounts. No sudden withdrawals. Nothing." I nodded, but my hands were already curled into fists. "Good." She adjusted her glasses. "They won't see it coming until it hits their bank app." By noon, the filing had been processed. 30 minutes later, Julia's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and gave me a grim smile. "First Ripple," she said, flipping her laptop around to show me a breaking news headline. "Prominent Boston couple named in fraud investigation over alleged real estate theft funds linked to lavish wedding." A blurry photo of Madison tossing her bouquet appeared just below the text. Richard and Karen stood behind her, clapping like puppets at a stage play. The article had no quotes yet, but it didn't need them. The phrase "family fraud" was enough to ignite curiosity. By 2:00 p.m., Julia had received 3 media inquiries. One reporter from Channel 7 even called my firm's office line. "We're not giving a statement," I told Julia, heart-pounding. "You won't," she said. "But I will." She drafted a short, controlled response for press. "My client is pursuing legal remedies for fraudulent transfer of inherited property. We will not be commenting further at this time." Just enough to confirm the story. Just enough to fuel the storm. And then came the email. It hit my inbox like a bomb. Subject regarding notarization of Lake Haven deed. Ms. Whitmore. "I am writing to formally state that I did not under any circumstance witness or notarize the documents in question. The signature and stamp attributed to me are forgeries. I will provide a sworn affidavit and am willing to testify. Regards, Leonard Knox." My breath caught. I forwarded it to Julia instantly. Seconds later, my phone rang. "I've never seen a cleaner opening for a criminal referral," she said. "They're cooked, and they know it." I let her words settle. For a long time, I had dreamed of this moment. Vindication, validation. But now that it was here, I felt less like cheering and more like sharpening a blade. Then, at 6:41 p.m., my father texted me. "Family meeting, tomorrow. Bring your lawyer. No pleas, no apology. Just a summons like I was a rogue board member." I stared at the screen, unmoving. Tomorrow, then. The table would be set. And this time, I wouldn't be the one swallowing my voice. They asked for a family meeting. I brought my lawyer. They brought lies. The Whitmore living room had always felt like a museum piece, too polished, too symmetrical, more performance than comfort. Today, it felt like a courtroom with bad lighting. Mid-afternoon light filtered through velvet drapes. The coffee table had been cleared of its usual floral arrangement, replaced by silence and tension so thick it felt choreographed. Julia sat to my right, a slim black folder on her lap, her gaze forward but cool. My father sat across from us in the leather armchair, fingers steepled like a man who thought boardroom posture still held sway in a criminal context. My mother sat beside him, posture tight, face already pinched in rehearsal grief. Madison and Ethan hovered near the fireplace, Ethan with his arms crossed, Madison visibly trembling. Aunt Ruth stood off to the side, silent but immovable like a sentry. And Uncle Charles and my cousin Debbie had been summoned apparently as neutral observers, though both looked like they regretted answering the call. No one spoke at first. It was the kind of silence that hoped I'd fold. I didn't. I placed a stack of documents on the table and slid them forward. Let's not pretend we don't know why we're here. My father cleared his throat. Claire Julia raised a hand without looking at him. Mr. Whitmore, you'll have time to respond, but first we will speak. And then she began. In June of this year, she said my client discovered that the deed to a property she legally inherited had been fraudulently transferred. Over the past 2 months, we've assembled extensive documentation, IP logs from failed banking access attempts, sworn testimony from a notary public disavowing any involvement, and a financial trail showing the rapid withdrawal and use of funds tied to the sale of Lake Haven Lodge. I opened my laptop and clicked on the first file. A screen mirroring device cast it across the living room TV. Slide 1, the deed with the forged signature. Slide 2, email from Leonard Knox, the notary. Slide 3, bank withdrawals, each time stamped, each mapped against wedding expenses. Julia continued, these actions constitute forgery, fraud, and unlawful conversion of property. Furthermore, my client has statements from third parties confirming premeditated intent to deceive. I clicked again. The fourth slide, an audio clip from the wedding planner recorded on my phone the night before the wedding. They wanted to rush the sale before Claire found out. Said it was easier that way. Silence. My mother's hands fluttered at her lap like trapped birds. Claire, sweetheart, don't. My voice was calm. Don't sweetheart me. This isn't a misunderstanding. It was a heist dressed in chiffon. My father leaned forward. We thought you'd understand. That you'd be generous. You didn't seem attached to the house anymore. You thought I wouldn't notice, I corrected. You thought I was the kind of daughter who would swallow it again, like every childhood summer when Madison got ballet lessons and I got a bus pass. Karen's voice broke. We were trying to give Madison a future. You sold mine to buy hers, I said. And you didn't just steal money. You stole meaning. That house was Grandpa's voice when no one else listened. It was mine. It still is. Richard's mask cracked for the briefest second, his lip twitching. You always were dramatic. I leaned forward. You always assumed my silence meant weakness. It didn't. It was restraint. A beat of silence followed. Even the antique clock on the mantel seemed to pause, and then Madison spoke, her voice brittle. Did you know Ethan? She whispered. He didn't answer. Her eyes darted to him. Did you know what they were doing? He looked at the floor, at the ceiling, anywhere but her face. Ethan, she said again, barely audible. He kept his mouth shut. And that was when I knew the fracture had widened. The family that orchestrated my silence was unraveling under the weight of their own script. No one likes to admit they raised a criminal, especially when they see their own reflection in the mugshot. The meeting at the Whitmore house had barely ended before Ruth followed me out the front door. She didn't say anything right away, just slipped a slip of folded paper into my hand like it was contraband. I waited until I was alone in my apartment to open it. He made 3 calls to a number linked to a Cayman account. I overheard him near the wine cellar last Thursday. I thought you should know. Ruth. It didn't take much. Julia had contacts in places where financial trails never stayed cold for long. By nightfall, her call came in. My friend at Hallwell Investments confirmed it. Ethan cashed out close to $85,000 right before the wedding. Said it was for a family emergency. But nothing hit your parents' accounts directly. It's floating. Offshore. Likely routed through dummy entities. I let the words sink in. And Madison? I asked. She's not named on anything, but she was copied on one internal email thread about venue payments, and she signed the luxury honeymoon suite contract herself. There's paper. Plenty. I thanked Julia and hung up. The apartment was dim warm with July heat, but I didn't turn on the lights. Instead, I opened my laptop and pulled up the wedding photos that had flooded social media. Madison's beaming face, Ethan's polished smile, the overpriced orchids curling over ice sculptures. So much sparkle, so little truth. I texted Madison. Me, we need to talk. Her, I'm not sure I can. Me, then I'll send everything to the reporters instead. 5 minutes later, her video call came through. I answered. She looked pale, her hair pulled into a frizzy ponytail, no makeup. She wasn't in Bali anymore. The honeymoon must have been cut short. "What do you want from me?" she asked. Not accusatory, just tired, hollow. I turned my camera off but left the mic on. Proof. Truth. "Let's start with Ethan." She blinked, then crumbled in slow motion. "He said it was to protect us. That our parents had no choice. That you'd never understand because you always needed everything to be so righteous." "Right," I said softly, "because protecting yourselves always meant erasing me." Tears welled in her eyes. "Claire, I didn't know everything. But you knew something I said sharper now. You knew about the sale 3 weeks before the wedding. Didn't you?" Madison froze, and then, in the smallest voice, she said, "Yes." I stayed silent. Let the weight hang. "I told myself you'd understand," she whispered. "That's what you always did. You just swallowed things. I thought you'd do it again." A tear rolled down her cheek. "You always made the rest of us feel safe by being the one who needed nothing." I shook my head. "You mean I made you comfortable?" She bit her lip, trembling. "I'm sorry." "No," I said quietly. "You're just sorry it didn't stay hidden." The silence stretched raw and awful. "You said once that love without respect is just manipulation," she said. "Were you talking about me?" I didn't answer. Instead, I reached forward and ended the call. My face was still blank, my pulse steady, the weight in my chest gone, replaced by something colder, cleaner, resolve. They built a stage with lies. Now the spotlight is theirs, and it's brutal. By the time the morning news aired the story, it had already hit the internet like wildfire. Local station first, then a regional segment. Within hours, Twitter threads were dissecting the timeline with forensic precision. Architect daughter has inheritance stolen for sister's six-figure wedding. Parents forged her name. The headline burned across screens. It didn't take long before they had names, photos, receipts. I didn't watch the full broadcast, just the intro. My own face flashed on screen, pulled from a professional bio. They used the worst possible shot, a freeze frame from an award ceremony mid-blink. Still, it wasn't me who looked bad. The story made that clear. Julia had warned me. Once it breaks, you won't control it. But the truth doesn't need a narrator. It just needs daylight. What I hadn't expected was the flood of messages. Former classmates, clients, strangers. "Thank you for standing up. I thought it was just my family. You are braver than I could ever be." Even in my firm's group chat, a space I typically muted, someone had posted, "Claire, we saw the piece. If you ever want time off or just to talk, we're proud of you." I didn't cry. I didn't even smile. I just breathed. And for once, it felt clean. What broke me wasn't the attention. It was the silence on the other side. Nothing from Richard or Karen. No email, no call, no press conference. Just retreat. Their neighbors were now whispering, I heard. His law firm had suspended him pending internal investigation. Karen's bridge club removed her from the fall luncheon committee. A social death for people like them. Then came the Carsons, the couple who had innocently bought Lake Haven. They filed a civil suit. I wasn't named. They knew I was as blindsided as they had been. But they wanted restitution, and I didn't blame them. Their email to me was kind, apologetic even. "We hope you get your home back. No one should go through what you've endured." That night, I walked past my childhood home. Not intentionally, it was on the way back from a late meeting with Julia. The house looked unchanged. White shutters, red door, perfectly trimmed hedges. but it felt like a museum now, a relic of myth, a place where everyone pretended long enough that no one noticed the rot in the foundation. And still I paused. Not from nostalgia, from recognition. I wasn't afraid of it anymore. The truth had outlived its prison. At my apartment, the building's mailroom was quiet. I flipped through bills and circulars and then stopped. A white envelope, thick stock, no return address. But I recognized the handwriting immediately. Karen Whitmore. In her perfect cursive, the kind she'd drilled into me every Sunday afternoon as a child when Madison was allowed to play outside. I didn't open it. Not yet. I carried it up to my apartment and placed it on the counter. Just sat there staring at it as the last light faded beyond the windows. It was probably apology. It was probably too late. When I stepped onto the dock, the wind didn't ask who I had to forgive. It just welcomed me back. The air smelled the same. That sharp green-blue scent of pine needles and deep water and old wood. The kind of smell no designer could replicate. Lake Haven had waited quietly through the chaos. And now it was mine again, not as a possession, but as a truth I had fought for. The house was technically empty, though not entirely. The staging company had left behind impersonal furniture, a tan love seat abstract canvas prints, a glass bowl full of fake lemons. Soulless. I opened every window, letting the September breeze move through like a cleansing ritual. The fake lemons went in the trash. I walked room to room. My footsteps echoed differently, less memory, more echo. But they would return. The place needed me as much as I had needed it. In the kitchen, I rolled up my sleeves and began sanding the cabinets. Layers of synthetic polish came off in waves, revealing Grandpa Arthur's woodwork beneath. I whispered an apology to him, and also a promise. Later that afternoon, I tackled the boat dock. The boards creaked underfoot, weather-warped and sun-bleached. I knelt with a drill and began replacing loose planks. Sweat pooled at my collarbone, but the ache in my muscles felt sacred. I wasn't trying to fix what had been broken. I was building something new atop what had survived. I only stopped when Aunt Ruth arrived. She didn't knock, just appeared at the top of the path holding a thermos of tea and a woven bag full of muffins. "You look like your grandfather did after his first winter storm," she said, handing me the thermos. "A little wrecked. A lot, right?" We sat on the porch sipping. The lake shimmered like metal in the late light. "I lost this place once," Ruth said softly. "Not legally like you, but emotionally. Your father and I were close once, until our mother died. Then the fight started about her will, about what mattered. And I let him rewrite the story because it was easier than shouting. I regret that. You're the only one who's ever said that," I replied. "Then maybe that makes it matter more." We didn't talk about my parents after that. We didn't need to. That evening, I started sketching again, something I hadn't done just for myself in months. The lines were tentative at first, then bolder. A guest studio behind the lodge nestled among birch trees. A retreat. For solitude. For quiet. For whoever needed a space that let them feel seen. It was nearly dark when I walked back to the dock. The lake was still barely rippling. I sat on the edge, my legs dangling over the water, Grandpa's flannel jacket wrapped around me. The quiet wasn't empty. It pulsed with memories. I could still hear Grandpa's voice somewhere deep in the trees. "You'll come back not to escape, but to remember who you are." I didn't cry. Not this time. Instead, I smiled, small, real. The kind of smile that comes from knowing you didn't run away. My phone buzzed beside me. It was a photo from Madison, a baby red-faced and swaddled in a yellow blanket. Big eyes, a tiny hand curled into a fist. Emma. The caption read, "She should know her aunt. If you'll have her." The moon rose behind me, casting light across the lake, and for the first time in a long while I didn't feel alone. Some inherit money, others inherit mess. I inherited a legacy and I defended it. The courtroom was quiet as the judge adjusted her glasses and read the final paragraph of the ruling aloud. My hands folded neatly on the table in front of me were steady. I didn't look at my parents seated across the aisle with their attorney, neither of them speaking. I didn't need to. Everything that could be said had already echoed too many times in my mind. Today was not about them. The court finds in favor of the plaintiff, Claire Whitmore. The judge announced, her voice clear, even. The property located at Lake Haven Lodge shall be returned to the plaintiff's name. Damages in the amount of $175,000 plus legal fees and emotional restitution are to be paid by the defendants Richard and Karen Whitmore. She banged the gavel once, just once, but it thundered through me like the closing of a long, unfinished chapter. Julia touched my shoulder lightly. It's over. I turned to her. It's not over. It's just finally mine. Outside the courthouse, a few reporters waited. One called my name, voice. Eager, Claire. Would you like to comment on what justice means when it comes to family? I paused, then looked straight at the camera. Justice means refusing to let betrayal write the end of your story. And with that, I walked away. No further questions. By the time I arrived back at Lake Haven that evening, the sky had turned the color of worn copper. Autumn had rolled in while I'd been in courtrooms and legal offices. Now the trees blazed orange and red around the lake like fire frozen in motion. The wind smelled of leaves, smoke, and pine. Home. I stepped onto the newly restored porch. Every board had been resealed, every beam scrubbed down to its original grain. I ran my fingers over the railing. This was the work of reclamation, not just of property, but of purpose. Inside the house had changed. It held my choices now. My colors. My lines. A small photo of Grandpa Arthur sat above the mantel. I'd placed it there the day the codicil was accepted into evidence. He was smiling, fishing pole in hand, frozen in time, immortal in memory. I poured a cup of tea and sat on the porch swing. The creak of the chain was familiar, rhythmic. I pulled out a notebook and opened to the last page of a letter I'd started weeks earlier, a letter to myself. Dear Claire, you were never just the quiet one. You were the one who remembered. I signed it and folded the page, tucking it into the back of the notebook. Then I stood and walked down to the dock. The water was calm, lit by the soft glow of dusk. I whispered to the wind I was never just the quiet one. I was the one who remembered. The wind didn't answer, but I felt it brushing against my skin like an old friend. Back inside, I sat near the fireplace sketching again. The guest studio plans had evolved. I was thinking of calling it Haven House, a space for those who'd been overlooked, underestimated, undone. My phone buzzed once, a message from Madison. No words, just the photo of Emma again. I looked at it longer this time. Emma's eyes. They were wide, curious, and so startlingly familiar. Like looking into a memory I hadn't realized was still alive. They looked just like Grandpa Arthur's. I didn't reply. Not yet, but I saved the photo. Some stories, I realize, don't end in clean lines. They echo, they ripple, they continue. Even in the quiet aftermath, the echoes of betrayal still lingered, but so did the triumph of truth. What began as a silent injustice ended in a courtroom where lies crumbled and legacies were reclaimed. Justice, though delayed, arrived with unwavering clarity, reminding us that silence is not always surrender, and dignity can be louder than rage. When injustice is met with courage and precision, even the deepest wounds can become proof of survival. Like, share, and comment your thoughts below. Type 1 if you felt her fight was yours too, or 2 if you think justice should have gone even further.